We're going to enter the twilight zone, as the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us, the 10 things that were created, Bein Hashmoshes, twilight of the very first Friday in creation. Then after that, the Mishnah adds other things that don't really seem to fit the theme of what was created at the time of twilight. Particularly, we're going to focus on tongs. Why does the Mishnah tell us that tongs were made just before Shabbos? And there's a great lesson over here about certain things that are beyond human reach and certain things that have no real value in and of themselves, but could be used for something of value. In einzigen Perek rechnet euch Satana asor dvorim was nivru be'erev Shabbos ben hashmoshes. So in the 5th Perek of Pirkei Avos, the Tana mentions 10 things that were created Friday afternoon as it was growing dark, bein hashmoshes. So then he lists the 10. Then he brings a second opinion, that on that list should also be the strange supernatural place where Moshe Rabbeinu was buried, that you could never find where it is. Wherever you are, it looks like it's somewhere else. And the miraculous ram that appeared just at the right time at the Akedah to be brought instead of Yitzchak. And then is Messiah. Then he says, and there's another opinion, Af hamazikin, that even those forces of destructive energy that exist in our world, va'af, and also tzvas b'tzvas asuya, that a tongs can only be made using another set of tongs. And that's one we're going to focus on. So the pirish von tzvas b'tzvas asuya is v'digmara zogt in psochim. What does it mean that tongs need tongs? So the Gemara tells us, at tzvas kann gemacht werden, wenn man benutzt dabei an andere tzvas, because in order to forge the metal, which is obviously going to be really, really hot, into a tongs, you need tongs to hold the metal. So the obvious question is, who made the first set of tongs? Because the only way to make tongs is by using tongs. Therefore the Mishnah tells us, as is given a bria bidei shamayim, Hashem himself made the first tongs. Und die tzvas is Hashem geworden bei Shabbos ben hashmoshes. And our Mishnah tells us, when did Hashem make it? Friday evening, as it was in between sunset and dark. Dann verstehen, so we have to understand, was ist der Sheiches von Brias HaTzvas zum Zman von Erev Shabbos ben hashmoshes? So you want to say practically Hashem had to make the first tongs? Fine. Why then? Why did the first tongs have to be Dafka Friday afternoon when it's almost Shabbos? When you look at the earlier things on the list in that Mishnah of what was created, Erev Shabbos ben hashmoshes, so the commentaries tell us, you know why these things had to be created at that unusual time? Because because these are things that don't belong into the ordinary class of ordinary creations, which were which were all made during the normal 6 days of creation. They're all miraculous. How the earth is going to open to swallow Kairach, or the script of the Luchos, or the mate, the staff that Moshe used for the plagues. They're all unusual. Therefore, the Mefarshim say they were created very close to Shabbos, because the Shabbos is this mana menucha v'ashbisu from Priyas Devarim Tivim, because Shabbos is when the process of natural creation ceases. Seeing as these are things that are supernatural, they don't belong to the natural creation process, so they're made right close to Shabbos. And that makes sense. But the fact that you need tongs in order to make tongs is not in TV. It's actually quite a natural thing. That's how you make tongs. And the fact that Hashem made the tongs, that's not surprising. Hashem made everything. All the creatures, all the plants. Die Metzius von aspetetigen Baal Chai oder Tzemeach muss ankommen zu Afridiken. Look, the nature of every living thing is, how do you get a plant? Because there had to have been another plant that produced seeds that grew this plant. How do you get an animal? Because there had to have been other animals that gave birth to these animals. Everything is bitzvas asuya, whatever asuya, had to come from somewhere. So you go back far enough and you get to the point where Hashem made it. So there's no surprise over here that he made a tongues. He also made humans, he also made animals, also made plants. So why, out of all the things that Hashem created from scratch, is Dafka the tongues on the list of these unusual things that Hashem made, Dafka at the last minute before Shabbos? The question is deeper than that. The Gemara sagt in Sanhedrin, the Gemara Sanhedrin tells us, as the time was Adam Harishon is Bashafin Givorim B'Yom HaShishi, we've heard this many times before, that Adam Harishon was dafka created on a Friday, Nochala Nivroim, later than everything else that was created, is, for what reason? That he should arrive in a world where everything is ready for him, that he can get straight to the Su'udah, and later we'll describe what the Su'udah is. But the world had to be ready for Adam Harishon. Now, according to our Mishnah, that the first set of tongs was created after Adam Harishon, right? Noch Brias Adam Harishon, it was created at the time of twilight. Kum tois says nirkiven hakol muchan. Turns out that not everything was ready for Adam Harishon. A key tool that he might need, an implement, wasn't available. Valditzvas is noch nirkiven muchan. The tongs were not yet available. So why? Why do it then? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Now, now, there's no question why the script of the Luchois or the donkey that was going to speak for Bilam, why those things were not created before the Marishan is not even a question. Because they are those are all allocated to events that will happen later in the future. So none of them had a relevance to the life of Adam Harishon himself. So if they're created later, after he's created, big deal. But tongs, surely tongs, there's no reason why tongs should be excluded from the everything that has to be ready for Adam Harishon. Which pretty much includes everything that was created in the 6 days of creation. So why? Why is it set aside? Another question. We have to understand. Why does the Mishnah say it in such an unusual way? Instead of saying, like with everything else on the list, and this was created, what does the Mishnah say? It's telling us a fact that tongs need tongs in order to be made. The language actually is not describing how the first tongs were made. It's actually just telling us a fact about how tongs are made. In fact, when it tells us that tongs are made from tongs, what are we actually talking about? The next set of tongs. We're saying when the next set of tongs arrived, they had to be made from tongs. And the question is, who made the first tongs? So you're not even talking about what was created at Bein Hashmoshes on Friday. You're talking about what it would be used to produce later on, which is very strange. So no, von dem denkt man as God erst tzvas hat gemus sein abri b'dei shamayim. It's just that you now got to calculate and work out, now that you think about it, the first tongues had to have been made by Hashem himself. Und von dem, was stellt dem Inyan in der Mishnah, and because where in the whole of Shas is this conversation had, in the Mishnah of the 10 things that were created on Friday, Ben Hashmoshes, versteht man, we can extrapolate, as dem it will the Mishnah sagen, as tzvas is beschaffen geworden bei Shabbos Ben Hashmoshes. We would work out that the tongues were created on Erev Shabbos at twilight. Now, lechaera what man gedacht sagen, surely the Mishnah should have said, made Klarkeit in a very clear way, over Kitzur and briefly, because remember the Rambam tells us that the language of Mishnah is always intended to be as brief and succinct as possible, should have just said, Ve'af atzvas, and also the tongues, like it said, Af amazikin, also the negative destructive forces. Actually, that's the way the Gemara Pesachim says it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af atzvas, Rabbi Yehuda says, also the tongues. So why does the Mishnah present it in such a roundabout way? Question 2, base. Now, this is very important because nothing is accidental in a Mishnah. So the fact that the one opinion says 2 things, mazikin und svas, destructive forces and tongues, is verstandig. That must imply that they must share something in common. It's because they share something in common. That's why both of them, according to this one opinion, they were both created at that time because they must share a certain theme. Now, emestaka, the truth is, and we'll come back to this again later, as from the that they say, and also tongues, nit utzvas, rather than saying and tongues, like the preceding opinion that said also the caver of Moshe and the ram of Avraham Avinu, but here it doesn't say that, it says af hamazikin, and af atzvas, is mashmas mazikin and tzvas ein bazunder protim. That already does separate the two as if they're in two different categories. But you cannot escape the fact, as they have that there has to be a common theme, and it's that common theme that prompts whoever this Yesh Omrim opinion is to say both of them in one breath. Because there's obviously one motivation for why both of them would have been created on Erev Shabbos. So we have to understand, what is the tzad hashova from mazikin and tzvas? How could there possibly be a common theme between destructive, demonic energies and tongues, which are actually quite useful? And lastly, what is the Roin Avodas Hashem Bechlal? What lesson could this teach us in how we serve the Eibishter? More specifically, and what would it teach us about serving Hashem beyond the requirement of the law, which, as the Gemara Bava Kama tells us, is what Masechta Avos is all about? That we could learn from the fact that the first tongs had to be made by Hashem, and they were made at this particular time. So, all the other things on the list, all played a unique role in Jewish history. The 10 makos through the staff, the luchos were obviously the presentation of the Torah, the Bilam's donkey, Korach's earth opening up, etc. They all played a role specifically to Jewish life and nobody else. In fact, some of the commentators on the Mishnah say, as die Sachen seinen letoy altam shel Yisrael, that they are things that were designed and created originally for our unique benefit. Tongues have no specific relationship to Jews. Anybody uses tongues. And there's nothing about tongues that relates specifically to how we serve Hashem. So the tongues story seems a very strange story. Wird man das verstehen, to understand why we have this strange story, so behaktem den Pirush Pnimi in the Maimon Chazal Hanal, we need to look at the more spiritual perspective on what this saying is from Chazal. As Adam Harishon is Vashavin Givorim B'Yom HaShishi, what did the Gemara tell us in Sanhedrin? Adam Harishon was created on the 6th day of creation after everything else. Why? Nachdem was alt is given muchan, so that everything else should be ready. Kedeshi kones the seuda miyad, that he should be able to immediately go into the seuda. What seuda? Which seuda are we talking about? As dos main, so the explanation is as soll haben als muchan zu kennen dann gleich sein avoida. The so-called seuda we're talking about over here is the avoida that Adam Harishon, by extension, all people had to do to serve Hashem. Everything has to be ready to support his avoida. That's what the Gemara is telling us. Rabbi says aklal, because we have a principle. Kol ma shenivra b'sheishes umei b'reishes tzrichin asiya tikun. The principle is everything that was created through the 6 days of creation was created with a certain imperfection and would require input and would require some level of upgrade. As it says in the pasuk, Asher boro Elokim, everything that Hashem created, la asois, to do. What does the to do mean? Letaken, to fix, to upgrade. And humans, particularly Jewish people, our job is to fill in the gaps, to elevate everything to its full potential. Und das meint die Seuda von Adam Harishon. That's the so-called feast that Adam Harishon now has to be prepared to partake in. In other words, die Sache, was darf haben für seine Avoida. This so-called feast that has everything ready means he's got all of the wherewithal, all of the resources that he needs in order to do his avodah. Kol mashenivra b'sheishes and made bereishes v'ser dafen taken sein. Everything that was created in the 6 days of creation, waiting for him to come and give it meaning and give it direction. It's all ready. Now he comes along and he gives it that meaning and direction. Das ist euch der Bir Pnimi Favos die Sachen, was seinen beschaffen geworden bei Shabbos ben Hashmoshes. Now we can understand why all the things on the list of what was created after Adam Harishon appeared on the scene, when it is already twilight of Erev Shabbos, those things are nicht von Seudas Adam Harishon. Not one of those things is part of Adam Harishon's scope of work, which is represented by the Seuda. Und bald as jeder Eid is bedugmas Adam Harishon, because every one of us is a reflection of and plays the role to an extent of Adam Harishon, as the pasuk says. And the Gemara learns from it, Atem Kuruyin Adam, that we specifically are called by the collective noun Adam, as opposed to other nations that might be called Ish or Gever, etc., or Enosh. is move on. The message is that all the things on that list that were created by Hashmoshos, they're not in the scope of our avodah, even though we came into the picture later. Why not? Because the 10 miraculous items on the list are not designated for us to use in our avodas Hashem. Not one of those things needs our help. They're perfect systems on their own. They're all things that Hashem created complete. They are good as is. They don't need us. For which reasons? That's why those things were created at the twilight of Erev Shabbos, bis to Shabbos, as close to Shabbos as you could possibly get. Because that's the time where you rest, because you don't have to work. Why were these things created at that time? To indicate they don't need our avodah, they don't need our input, they don't need our work. They're going to happen regardless of us. Now, of course, on Shabbos we also have a means of serving Hashem. The way that we serve Hashem on Shabbos is not like we do the rest of the week, where we engage the world and refine the world and extract value out of the world. Shabbos is when Kodesh moved from Weltsachen in Yonei Chol. Shabbos is a time where we're completely removed from anything mundane. So what is our avodah on Shabbos? Nor di avodah is in Kedusha Gufa. It's a time where we focus within the space of holiness and absorb as much out of the space of holiness as we possibly can. We daven, we learn, we engage with our families in a meaningful way. So that we could ascend higher and higher in our own spiritual process. And that's why that's a time of the week where our avodas Hashem is very pleasurable. It's not exertion. It's not schlepping. So that's what the 10 things created by Hashmoshos on Erev Shabbos are. They're already in that realm. They don't need our work. That's on the positive side. So in the same way as these 10 items on the list, plus the overall concept of working of what we do to serve Hashem on Shabbos, are not part of the normal day-to-day avodah represented by the so-called Su'uda of Adam Harishon. And the reason they're not part of the process is because they're beyond the process, they're greater than the process, they're higher than the process. And as we've mentioned, they don't need our help. So that's on the one extreme. Equally on the other extreme, there are other things that are not accessible for us to be able to fix. They're not ready. They're not ripe for improvement. Because they're at a much lower state than everything that was created during the 6 days of creation. So therefore, in the normal course of serving Hashem, we're not empowered to shift that part of the world. It's too stuck. How can we fix them? So normally, the way that we engage with the world is v'chai b'hem. You've got to balance. This is what the world expects. This is what my life needs. This is what Yiddishkeit expects. But I have to keep myself alive. That's primary. If a person wants to touch that part of the world and elevate that part of the world that is not fundamentally holy, that is not is not susceptible to holiness, that's going to need, not from Mesiras Nefesh, that's going to need the avodah of Mesiras Nefesh, from B'chol Mo'idecha, where a person pushes themselves completely beyond themselves, Hecher von seine Tivus Dika Hagbolis, beyond their natural parameters of being. And that's why these things, for a completely different reason, are not on the table. They're not part of our natural avodah. Because the way that Hashem mapped out how we should serve Hashem is in a normal way that doesn't threaten or undermine our lives. Where things follow a normal, logical progression. The word Adam actually implies this. Was die Oisius Adam weisen ki Adoif and Sir Masuda von Adam. Adam represents Aleph, then Dalet, then Mem. Things progress in a natural, logical process. Roish, Guf, Regel. You prioritize the head, and then you focus on the torso, and then you deal with the legs. Machshava, Dibra, Maisa. First you process things in your mind, then you make sure to speak appropriately, then you behave appropriately. Avodah Mesudora. A very organized and rational approach to serving Hashem. But when it comes to the avodas Hashem, which is with all your so-called might, as we loosely translate it, then you're taking the same word Adam. When we switch around the letters of Adam, and you get there from the same letters you get ma'oid, which means pushing ourselves beyond ourselves. So what do we have? We've got a list of things that don't belong to normal day-to-day life. Most of those things, because they don't need us, they're above our range, we can't affect them. Hashem presented them into this world in perfection. And then there are a couple of things that, in order for us to have any impact on them, is going to take a massive personal investment that takes us totally not only out of our comfort zone, but out of our normal day-to-day Jewish reality. Those are the two things that this particular opinion in the Mishnah refers to, the mazikin and the tongs. Now, mazikin is easy to see why that's stuck. Mazikin sein nicken Sachen in welches is da tikkun avodas ha'adam. There is nothing in our avodas Hashem that is going to enter the world of mazikin, of destructive forces, and fix them. Avodah said to mitzaken sein, right? There's no avodah to fix them. Ze metzias hat sich geschaffen mitzad dem chet ha'adam. How did mazikin exist in the first place? Because Adam Arishan ate from the chet etzadas. When Avodah is a shedel zayin, ze me'abed zayin. So the only approach, the only way that we should engage with mazikin is block them out, completely negate their existence. Even though the ultimate state would be to take even the darkest, most inappropriate, most toxic forces and transform them to become good and positive and holy. B'leshon Chazal, as the expression goes about what's going to happen in the time of Mashiach, mashbison shelo yaziku. You completely neutralize their capacity to cause damage. Ze seinen aber nit mazik ois mazikin. They lose that possibility to be able to do damage. So in Zegufa, but that's not because we change them, it's because we manage them, neutralize them. It's not like we go through some kind of a process that extracts out of the mazikin, there's a spark of goodness in them too. The Metzias Zera is das, was a seinen mazikin. They're shifting reality is they are destructive. Now, but if we do our avodah properly, we're able to create something new in their experience. They become neutralized mazikin compared to mazikin that used to exist before. You can't fix the mazik. You can only shatter it like a vessel made out of cheres and reconstitute it again. Which explains why those destructive forces would have been introduced into the world, specifically as you get really close to Shabbos. When the Eibishter designed mazikin, what was the thought process? What was the goal? What was the objective of mazikin? The goal was that eventually they'd be flipped. That eventually they'd be cured, that eventually they'd become something healthy. So where do they emerge from? That time that is getting close to Shabbos. Because this great shift that's going to happen to the mazikin, that they'll lose their teeth, is not something that is feasible within the ordinary course of life. No dafke mitzad dem koyach von Shabbos, was is hecher von Intimididas from Welt. The only thing that is powerful enough to change, to alter, to neutralize mazikin is something which is beyond the natural course of the world, represented by Shabbos. Und Is euch die avoida nicht von der Suda shel ha'adam, and that's why the avoida that is going to turn around mazikin is not part of what's on the table of the so-called feast of Adam Harishon, which is the day-to-day way that we serve Hashem. Wie bald das der Tikkun von die mazikin ist durch dem, was der Adam geht, arois von sein Adam. Because the only way to have a positive impact on mazikin is to escape the ordinary, seine tivius dika hagbolos, the normal human with his limitations. And that will help us to understand the tongs, which are not identical, because nobody's going to say the tongs are negative, and that's why it says af, and also, in other words, less so, the tzvas, the tongs. So now this opinion continues to say, and also the tongs were created Erev Shabbos ben Hashmoshos. Why? Mitzad an enlichen tam vi bei dem mazikin. Because there is something about the nature of tongs which is in some way similar to the nature of mazikin. And because of that, it also belongs in this moment of creation, twilight of Erev Shabbos. That's what links the tzvas in a certain fashion to mazikin and explains why it's created at that time. Now, by tzvas, it's not as if by mazikin, but there's no question that the tongs and the mazikin are not the same. That's why he puts in also, to say it's not the same, it's not at that level, it's not as toxic as mazikin, there's something similar. What's something similar? So the wording of the Mishnah will explain what is similar. And the hasbara in them is val tzvas b'tzvas asuya. The wording of the Mishnah is that you need to know that tongues are produced using tongues. That's the clue. Why is that the clue? By saying those words, the Tana is able to illustrate to us as the Matoras Habriya von der erste Tzvas is, why did Hashem create the first tongues ever? Is given ausschließlich zu dem, was man soll kennen, machen der noch a zweite Tzvas. The only reason the first tongues was ever created was to be able to fashion another tongs, because theoretically they could have just made a mold and poured hot metal into the mold and had tongs. So why did the Eibusha Dafka get on board and make the tongs? Because the Eibusha wanted to create something that has its sole purpose is not for itself, but what it will do for something else. Anything else that was created in the 6 days. Even those things that produce other things, animals, people, plants, or they're used to produce other things, so you use grain in order to produce food, etc. Everything else, in addition to the fact that they facilitate something else, or they propagate something else, or they produce something else, they also have a personal intrinsic value. There's a value to an animal even if it never has children. There's a value to a stalk of wheat even if we don't eat it. But how was the first tongues created in a specific way? As in, it is nicht given kein matora v'tachlis far sich. It's created in a way that it has no inherent value or purpose. The only reason these tongues were made was to facilitate future tongues. There's no value in the tongues now. As Adam Harishon, you can machen a zweite tzvas, and of course specifically that Adam Harishon would be the one to be able to fashion other tongues using these. Now, jedinin was is da in Welt is da früher in Torah. Whatever plays out in the physical reality is just a reflection of how things are in Torah. So therefore, the union von tzvas b'tzvas asuya in Torah, there must be the concept of something that exists for the benefit or value of something else, like these tongues that have no personal value, they're just there for something else, must also exist in Torah. And that is the category we call is din von hechsher mitzvah, the way in which we prepare to be able to do a mitzvah. In order to do a mitzvah, you need certain implements, you need certain prerequisites. So the behulas hechsher is nicht a mitzvah. Whatever you use to prepare for the mitzvah is not in and of itself a mitzvah. Now, bloß ein Zeu durch welchen me kommt zu mekayim seiner mitzvah miteinander sach. The preparation for the mitzvah is just a medium by which you get to eventually be able to do the mitzvah. Here's an example. Viti Dugma, famous example, big machloikas in the Gemara Shabbos. Kersin eitzim lasis pechomin lasis barazel leizma lemila. Right, the famous Rabbi in the Mila, that you could cut wood on Shabbos to burn, to produce coals, to be able to heat metal, to be able to fashion a knife, to do a bris on Shabbos. Nobody will argue that the wood is not a mitzvah. Chopping the wood is not a mitzvah. Burning the wood is not a mitzvah. All the wood is a prep to be able to do the mitzvah. The wood is to prepare coal, the coal is to prepare heat, the heat is to prepare metal, the metal is to prepare a knife. Nobody would suggest that the wood is part of the mitzvah. So when you look at that example of the wood in this case, or various other examples like it, where it is purely just to facilitate the mitzvah, so logic would say, even the logic that is grounded within Torah, that wood has no facility for absorbing holiness. Just can't. Just the act of chopping the wood. So whether you're doing it on Shabbos or not is irrelevant. That's a different conversation. But chopping the wood so that you'll have the facility to create the knife, to be able to do a bris. The chopping the wood doesn't yet introduce godliness into this world. You can't even say that the chopping of the wood is somehow incorporated in the process of the mitzvah. It's not. Let's say that a person eats, and their goal is that I want to have nutrition in my system, so I have the energy to be able to serve Hashem. There, the Alter Rebbe tells us that the energy of that food and of that act of eating gets to be incorporated into the mitzvah that it powers. Because the person does that mitzvah or learns that Torah using the power of the food that they ate. But in the case of hechsher mitzvah, the preparation for the mitzvah, like chopping the wood to make the fire, to make the coal, to heat the metal, to be able to make the knife for the milah, that is not really part of the mitzvah. The entire purpose of the wood is to facilitate something that will follow afterwards. It's tongs, where their only purpose is to make other tongs. Das is the chiddush in der Mishnah. That's what our Mishnah wants to switch. That perspective is what our Mishnah comes to switch. Even the tongs that is only produced to facilitate other tongs, even though the entire purpose of the creation of this tongs was only to facilitate future tongs, Hashem got personally involved at this very lofty level. The Matzil, the producer of all the great spiritual existences, got personally involved in producing these tongues. That's a shift for us. You'd say the tongues are not important, they're not relevant, they're only there to facilitate something that I really need. Well, the Eibishter felt it was important enough to make it himself. And once you recognize that, wow, it's pretty obvious that these original tongues are divinely fashioned, and you can no longer say, as the Matorah von ihr ganze Metzius is menit vitzlublan dazach, you can't say that the Eibishter creates something that has no intrinsic value, and that its only value is what it will do for something or someone else. And you can't say that once this tongue has now made other tongues, it is now worth nothing because you have other tongues. Who needs these tongues anymore? The chiddush of our Mishnah is, if the Eibishter made the tongues, they are inherently valuable. Why are they inherently valuable? Remember, everything in the physical realm is just a reflection of how things are in Torah and in truth. Why does it play out this way in the physical story? Because in Torah. That's how it is in the reality of Torah. Even though if you were to follow a step-by-step normal process of serving Hashem, a logical process of serving Hashem, is in a hechsher mitzvah, you'd say, hechsher mitzvah, the pre-steps, the pre-operation steps, have no real validity for the mitzvah. That's what logic says. But when you recognize that there's a perspective which is the true perspective, how Hashem wants things to be, looking through Hashem's eyes, was ist da, in dem ist nicht chilekt zwischen der Mitzvah Gufa, was ist Mamshechelikus, und der Herrscher Mitzvah. David is illustrating to us over here that from a perspective of truth, there's actually no difference between the mitzvah and the preamble that created the possibility of the mitzvah. And therefore, very powerful, potent lesson. Remember, we asked, what's the lesson for us? When a person has a very advanced experience of surrender of self to Hashem's supernal will, which extends way beyond the person's rational mind, is when you're in that reality, it makes no difference what Hashem wants. But the Alter Rebbe sagt, like the Alter Rebbe very famously says, that even if an individual had been instructed by Hashem to do what appears to be the meaningless task of chopping wood, which would not be able to bring together spiritual realms and draw godliness into the world, is dos mekaymet denselben koch. The person is completely dedicated to Hashem. It's got nothing to do with me. So if I have to chop wood, I'll chop wood with the same dedication, and the same passion, and the same investment as if I was doing the greatest mitzvah that I could imagine. And that's why the tongs are linked to that special time as you're going into Shabbos. Because to reach the point where the hechsher mitzvah, where the precursor to the mitzvah has the value of elikus, to reach that point, I have to escape myself. I have to reach a point that I'm completely aware only of what Hashem wants without any imposition of my personal opinions. Von der Avodah Masudora Kanal, I've got to break out of the normal, rational, expected, comfortable way to serve Hashem. Und davon wird nicht ich bin zu Bruim Gashmiim, and because that's how it is conceptually in spiritual Torah terms, that actually translates into what happened in the physical story as the Brias Atzvas is given by Shabbos Ben Hashmoshes, that the creation of the first tongues had to be at what time? The time that's outside of the natural time, the time that's already associated with Shabbos. That then teaches us a lesson about living beyond the requirement of the law. This is to teach us how much personal investment we need to put into those things that are not the mitzvah itself, but are just the preparation for the mitzvah. Meiser Rav, a very clear story in the Gemara illustrates this point. A story that we always tell and we don't necessarily stop to think about it. The Gemara tells us the amazing work of Rabbi Chia to preserve Judaism and Torah. That Rabbi Chia didn't only personally involve himself in teaching young children Torah, but he personally got involved in the preparation to be able to teach them Torah, and even the preparations to the preparations. Hechsher lehechsher. There's not only hechsher mitzvah, but hechsher lehechsher zum limud Torah. What does that mean? Allein eingesät flax. He personally went and planted flax. Ois gewebt Netzen. He personally wove nets. Gefangen Hirschen. He personally caught deers in those nets. From that gemach klaf, he personally made the parchment, and then on those parchments he wrote the different parts of Torah that he distributed and circulated through the children. Is das Tomer B'Yosef? Think about it. It seems so strange. Why does Rabbi Chia have to get his hands dirty? Could he not delegate that work to one of his students or one of his servants? Could he not have found somebody who's not a full-time Torah scholar and allowed them to do all the dirty work, and then he'd come along and he'd actually put it together and teach the Torah, which is his area of expertise? Not but because he had such a superior level of submission to Hashem's supernal will. Is by him dieselbe Mesira unesina. He had equal dedication, derselbe Koch, equal enthusiasm in the Inyanim von Herrscher, wer Herrscher leHerrscher, wenn der Mitzvah allein, to the precursors and the precursors to the precursors for the mitzvah, as much as to the mitzvah itself from which, of course, we could all learn, and Mitzvah Hashem, that will become the hechsher to the Geula HaMitzvah Shlema, the coming of Mashiach now.